After asking the question, "How will I know this?" he says, "For I am an old man and my wife is advanced in years." And that was the real issue. That was the real problem and the struggle Zechariah was having. He understood the basics of biology and aging. He understood that he and Elizabeth were past their prime. He knew that in light of their advanced ages and given their years of unanswered prayers, if he and Elizabeth were going to have a child, it would necessitate some sort of miracle of divine intervention. And Zechariah thought that such a miracle was so extremely unlikely to happen that even if an angel of God were to announce it, as was the case here, he wasn't prepared to believe. Unlike Abraham, in Romans 4:18, Paul says this of Abraham: "In hope against hope, he believed, so that he might become a father of many nations." Zechariah here wouldn't believe. He refused to believe. He was a righteous man, but he was not a perfect man, clearly. There are a few things for us to note here as we consider this righteous man's unbelief. First would be this: his unbelief was rooted in his failure to remember the faithfulness of God. Specifically, Zechariah failed to remember the faithfulness of God not only to he and Elizabeth in their very personal lives and in their marriage throughout their lives, but the faithfulness of God to childless couples just like he and Elizabeth in generations past. Just think of the number of accounts in the Old Testament of both barren couples and aged couples who were blessed by God ultimately with children. Surely a faithful and righteous man and priest that he was, Zechariah knew of these accounts. He would have known of the stories of Isaac's birth and Samson's birth and Samuel's birth. But now that this promise of a birth in his own home was being offered, a birth that would happen in his marriage with his wife, Elizabeth, those accounts were out the door. They were out the window. They left no lasting impression on him. In this moment, rather, as he faced this angel who was now making this similar announcement to him, somehow Zechariah managed to block out and forget that God had accomplished the seemingly impossible in these very circumstances before. And it's somewhat ironic, because Zechariah's name, we've seen this in prior studies, means God remembers. But here, Zechariah was showing his own failure to remember all that God had done. Second, Zechariah's unbelief was rooted in his failure to recognize how his prayers were being answered right before his very eyes. Remember, he and Elizabeth had prayed for a child. They had prayed for the Messiah to come. He knew as a well-trained Israelite priest that the Messiah would be preceded by a forerunner. And now with the angel of God in his presence and the reality of his prayers being answered, right there staring him in the face in the person of an angel, verse 13, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been heard." He's now suddenly unable to put two and two together. He's now unable to connect the dots. He's unable to think about how the Zechariah of years before, when he was a young man, would have rejoiced over this news. But now with the passage of time and the passage of years, and with each passing month in which Elizabeth did not become pregnant, and the sadness and the disappointment and the frustration and the hopelessness that had set in, rather than expressing joy and thanksgiving over this news, about the fact that their prayers had been answered, Zechariah here is expressing doubt and consternation. Third aspect of his unbelief here is that Zechariah's unbelief was rooted in his unwillingness to take God at his word. Here this priest was standing in the presence of an angel of the Lord, a messenger of God. He'd received a word from the Lord through this angel. He's heard these words clearly. There's no error or confusion or hedging about what the angel is saying to him, but Zechariah, having heard it, wasn't buying it. The word of God wasn't sufficient for him. He needed something more. He needed a sign. Now, preachers will sometimes lament the difficulty of preaching the Gospels because of the difficulty of bridging the gap from then to now and drawing this straight line from the context of what was happening over there in first century Judea to what is happening in our lives today. Here, there really isn't all that much difficulty, because there are several parallels that we can draw between what Zechariah was going through here and what we go through in our lives today. as those who have been declared righteous before God by putting our faith in Jesus Christ. When we go through our own cycles of doubt and unbelief, when we get caught in a cycle of thinking that this or that relationship is irreconcilable, or that hope of a spouse is unattainable, or that wayward child's will is unbreakable, we can look at what was exposed here in Zechariah's heart and ask ourselves, are we tempted to fall into the same traps of doubt and unbelief? And in doing so, are we somehow like Zechariah, forgetting the faithfulness of God? Are we somehow like Zechariah, failing to see how God is answering our prayers, maybe not the way that we would want him to answer those prayers, but the way he's designed to answer those prayers? Are we in any way refusing to take God at his word?